This is an apple, and the problem that I was addressing is that in last year's portfolio assessments, it was clear that TASTE students have lower research and reading scores compared to other BCC students. And we've noticed that this has actually gotten worse over the last few years. So I was attempting to do something about the research scores, and another apple in the future is going to look at reading scores. My solution was to adapt writing workshop methods, try and put them into the composition class. I had, because of an accident in the fall, I had not taught my regular 1A class and worked in the writing workshop. And I thought there were things there that could be useful. So the specifics are that students spent an hour in the writing lab for 8 weeks. So while they were writing 2 different research papers, 4 weeks for each paper. And 2 writing coaches from the workshop came into my class during that time, and they met with the students individually. The same idea in the writing workshop exactly. They gave specific suggestions. Sometimes in the beginning they would help with brainstorming, then later they would actually be reviewing drafts. And then they check off the progress on this checklist, which started with the big picture, control of the thesis in the whole essay, and then down to set several issues. And they received points with it, so there was pressure to do it. So the results, I started to hear grumblings about it about the 3rd week into the first paper. And so I hadn't decided ahead of time how I was going to evaluate it, but I decided that the next week when they turned in the first paper, I would have a full class discussion and evaluation of it. So this is what resulted. They felt pressured to have the conferences, which they were, to receive their points. They didn't like having to go through the sequential checklist because they wanted to jump down to oftentimes the sentence level issues before they addressed larger issues. A number of them waited until the due date to get everything checked off, and of course that didn't work for the lab because then the coaches were overwhelmed. Nonetheless, they voted, we actually took a vote, they voted overwhelmingly to continue lab, but they wanted it to be voluntary. So I met with Jenny, since she has so much experience. She was my co-Apple person, and she has so much experience in the writing workshop, and we thought, well, as long as this is an experiment anyway, let's just try it as the voluntary approach for the 2nd paper. So that's what we did. So we still had, everything was volunteer. Oh, we decided, I'm remembering now what I'm trying to say, is that, so there was no pressure to have conferences because there were no points attached to it. I just refigured the points for the class. But we did say that they had to work through things sequentially because we didn't want them to be jumping down to sentence level issues before they addressed the paper as a whole. So we met some of their demands, but not all of them. When we tried to think about why there was such difference between what happened in this class and the workshop, which has been very successful with other students, I think it comes down to how much choice students have. First, students in 208, which is the workshop, are choosing the method, so they know they're going to be having individual conferences. They've decided that's a method that's going to work for them. The second one, which Jenny and I think is the most important, is that there's a more flexible time frame for completing the essay. So in the workshop, where they're working on papers for other classes, they can spend however long they want on that revision, even after it's due in the other class. And sometimes that's when some of the best work actually can get done because they're not so pressured about getting it in. Whereas in my class, they had to get it done in this 4-week period. And I think some students were just not able to get all enough to make use of that. And the last one is that students in the 208 are choosing their workshop time, because several students did comment to me that the last hour of class, which was the only time we could use the lab, and these were working adults, so they've worked all day and now they've had 4 or 5 hours of class, and this is the last hour. They just found it too hard to make good use of that time for serious writing. It was fine for looking up things online, for added evidence for their papers, but not for writing. Our future steps, and Jenny is supposed to speak to this, so maybe she can sometime later, is that we're thinking that possibly instituting the whole process is not the best way. But Jenny teaches this class for coach training, and she felt like aspects of that, are you in that?
Oh, I teach writing workshop.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
She felt that aspects of that could be useful for teaching both composition teachers and for us teaching students in our class as peer coaches for some specific task could be useful. So she wants to do an apple on that in the future. She's already got some people signed up for that, I guess. And so she'll speak to that whenever she gets here. Okay.
Would you try it again, do you think, or not? Or maybe modify it?
Well, actually, I do. There's a practical issue for me, is that, which goes along with that last point, that I actually think students who are in that situation of having worked all day and then have 4 to 5 hours of class do need to get up and move somewhere and do something different. So I would like for them to go to the lab, but I'm thinking of trying more sentence level things at that point, because I think at that point in the evening, they would do better with that.
Which leads us into this, huh? Doesn't it?
I guess.
Oh, that was not as major.
This is a
An organic trend.
Oh, and with the figs and the apples, it's perfect.
But Sandy, they only did the lab stuff when they were working on those 2 papers, right?
Well, the first 4 weeks was an overview of research writing, and they did use the lab then they had some assignments for using the library databases
Okay.
and things like that, but they weren't actually writing their own papers then.
Okay.
I'm excited about that thing Jenny's going to do, especially the idea of training students in how to coach each other or take more ownership of the revision process. Because I think a lot of us kind of go back and forth and do peer feedback in different ways, different results, and a lot of people are just like, oh, it doesn't help, I'm not going to do it. And so the idea of figuring out what works, because there is all of this background of years of writing workshop and seeing what people can take from that is very exciting.
Yeah, I think so too. I think the writing workshop has so much to offer, so I hope that that will be a way to bring that into classroom.
We had also talked about, I think, once you give this paper back and ask them to correct stuff, then how do you follow up on that? And I think you said you gave extra credit, or maybe that was somebody else. I can't remember.
That was me.
Okay, somebody else. Maybe it was Meredith. But unless you conference individually with them after that, how do you know if they do the corrections on their own? Like I do some, and then I say you do the rest, and I mark some. But then I don't know if they ever do that or not, unless I conference with them and we go over it, and I can't conference with every student after every paper. But I feel like that's really key, and I try to write down what they need to work on, but then it becomes an ownership thing there, and if they don't do that, they're not going to improve. So how to also, once they're, outside of the writing workshop, to keep on doing that for themselves.
Does your portfolio process help with that? We don't do the same process in PACE, so I wondered if they're turning that paper in then for their portfolio?
I don't know
that's
if
right. They don't get to have
I
that
mean,
later.
ideally, I keep saying it, to help you do better on the future papers and the portfolio, do these corrections, but I don't know if they really do it or not. I don't think a lot of them do.
But they're not turning in that same paper again in the portfolio?
No.
Yeah,
No.
okay, I forgot that.
I wonder if there could be like final conferences where some of those little details could be addressed.
I try to do it before the end of the semester so that they do it for the rest of their papers. So I try to do it sort of mid-semester. But I'm always struggling with that because that's so important.
Right, so I actually brought that up in the writing workshop. I talked a little bit about what you did and the findings and the idea, which I believe the idea is, so correct me if I'm wrong, this is kind of interesting since I wasn't here to hear what you said, to see whether we can find applications of what we do in the writing workshop for the classroom. Is that right?
And particularly ways that you train coaches that might be useful for that kind of training for the teachers as well as sometimes students in our class doing peer work.
Right, and so my head wasn't here, so I have to kind of get my head back here. Some of the things we talked about were, for example, teaching, and Lori, you and I haven't had a chance to talk about this, but we had a really interesting conversation about it. We talked about what students could be trained to do in terms of helping each other learn to edit. Not peer review each other's work, but learn to edit. So for example, we talked about training students in pairs to hear each other read their work out loud and slow them down if they're not reading what's on the page. That kind of thing. So that there are things that we train our writing coaches to do that we could actually train students to do for each other, and it would help them learn some skills for themselves as well. So those are, we were trying to come up with strategies for applying what we do in the writing workshop to a classroom setting. And that's an example, right, Sandy?
Yeah.
One of the ones that we talked about.
Would this be so that we would, as the instructor, would be teaching students to develop these skills?
Exactly.
So we might have a master class going over these skills. And we're just
Exactly.
working- Oh, yeah.
Exactly. So, we've been working, and Lori has been really instrumental in this as well, as we have the ESL writing workshop and the English writing workshop. We've been developing strategies for years now in this particular, and Laura Zink is another teacher in the writing workshop, you know what I'm talking about. And so we thought, since you can't bring the class to the writing workshop, bring the writing workshop to the class or something like that, see what of the things that we've learned to do might be applicable.
That's a good name for
Classroom
it.
setting.